I was sitting with a friend the other day while she was scrolling through her phone, looking for a specific brand of hypoallergenic detergent.
Okay.
She looked so focused, almost clinical. And I joked, I said something like, "You're a real logistics queen." And she didn't like that.
She didn't laugh. She just stopped. And she looked at me with this expression that it wasn't pride. It was closer to this quiet, just vibrating exhaustion. And she said, "If I don't remember this, the chain breaks. If the chain breaks, my son gets a rash, my husband gets stressed, and the whole house feels like it's on fire." And then she said, "I'm not organized, not just on guard."
That phrase, on guard, that says everything.
It really does. Because on the surface, she's just doing a chore, right? But looking at her, you realized she wasn't just managing a household. She was acting as a human shock absorber.
Yes, she's anticipating the fallout. Exactly. She wasn't just thinking about laundry. She was anticipating the emotional fallout of a tiny domestic failure before it could even happen.
Yeah.
She was scanning for threats that didn't even exist yet.
Like a radar dish constantly spinning.
Yes. In a room that's supposed to be her sanctuary. And, we've been told for years that the mental load is just a problem of organization.
Right. That if you just had a better app or a better chore chart.
Or more help with the dishes or the school runs, the weight would just lift. Yeah. It's such a comfortable, tidy lie. We treat it like a cluttered desk that just needs a better filing system.
But it's not a filing system.
No. When you watch the way a woman's eyes move across a room, sensing a shift in her partner's mood or a child's quiet withdrawal, you realize it's something so much more primal.
It's not a to-do list.
It's a surveillance system.
That's it.
And why is that? Why is it that a woman can be sitting perfectly still in a quiet house and yet be performing this high-stakes labor of anticipation that would, frankly, exhaust a professional air traffic controller? We call it worry or being detailed. But what if this permanent state of alert is actually a survival strategy? What if the reason women can't just relax is because they are living in a world where their emotional security has always been conditional?
Where they've learned that the only way to stay safe
is to hold the entire world together without making a sound.
That narrative, that story, it just perfectly encapsulates the core of what we're going to get into in this deep dive.
It feels like the heart of the issue.
It is. We're talking about the psychological transformation of this mental load from what we think of as a simple shared domestic task list into a high-stakes chronic internal alert system. We really have to move beyond this common assumption that it's just a problem of task allocation. Who does the dishes?
It's so much bigger than the dishes.
It is. We have to recognize it as a state of constant hypervigilance. And this hypovigilance, it's driven by these deeply rooted historical gender roles and a sort of a subtle, persistent lack of long-term emotional security.
That's the key part right there. Conditional security.
Yes. Where personal safety and comfort are perceived as being conditional upon the smooth, quiet operation of the entire household. So our mission today is really to unpack this shift.
Okay.
To examine how this burden of anticipation and management, all this invisible labor, isn't just stressful. It has become an adaptive yet profoundly damaging survival strategy that impacts mental health, physical health, and the quality of our relationships.
I think the most important starting point then is establishing a clear vocabulary. We have to define exactly what this invisible labor is, because if you can't name it, if you can't measure it,
it will always be dismissed.
Yeah, it'll just be dismissed as worrying too much.
That's absolutely right. The starting point for any, meaningful discussion here is distinguishing between the work everyone sees, the physical chore.
Doing the dishes, mowing the lawn.
Right, which sociologists call instrumental or physical labor, and the invisible mental work. Cognitively. And cognitive household labor, it's defined as the managerial activities that are necessary to achieve communal goals. It's the constant monitoring of the entire system to ensure stability.
Okay, so what does that managerial activity actually look like in practice? Because I think it's often really hard to separate the thinking from the doing.
It is. They're very intertwined. But cognitive labor can be broken down into 4 distinct essential stages.
Okay.
First, there's anticipating needs. So recognizing that the winter coats need cleaning or that your child has a dental appointment that's coming up in 6 months.
Stuff that's way out on the horizon.
Exactly. The future planning. Second is identifying options. Figuring out which dry cleaner to use or which dentist takes your insurance.
The research phase.
Third is deciding between options, choosing the best time, making the actual appointment, or placing the order online.
Okay, so the decision.
And finally, and this part often gets missed, monitoring outcomes, checking to see if the coat was cleaned properly or following up to see if the bill was paid correctly.
So it's not done when it's done.
No. Instrumental labor only comes in when you actually go to the dry cleaner or drive the child to the dentist. All of those preceding mental steps, that's the invisible burden.
That's a great breakdown. So when a couple agrees to, say, share their grocery shopping, the instrumental labor, the physical act of going to the store, might be split 50-50.
Right.
But the cognitive labor, anticipating when the milk will run out, identifying the best sales, deciding on the weekly meal plan, that often remains, 100% on one partner.
Exactly. And the very nature of this work is why it's so incredibly draining. It's boundaryless.
What do you mean by that?
It runs in the background like a perpetual application on your phone, you know? It's just consuming battery power even when you aren't looking at the screen.
That's a fantastic analogy.
You might be in a high-stakes work meeting, but a tiny sliver of your attention is dedicated to this micromanagement system running in your head. Did I remember to defrost the chicken? Does that permission slip need signing?
It's always on.
It's always on. And because it happens concurrently with other tasks, and it's often entirely internal, it has historically been so difficult to measure using traditional time use studies. And that has led to a massive underestimation of the gender disparity.
But now we can measure it. We have the data. And the data is, frankly, it's shocking. It confirms that the inequality gap is significantly wider for the thinking and the planning than it is for the actual execution.
Oh, the quantitative data from recent studies, especially in heterosexual partnered households, confirms this in vivid detail. When researchers assessed about 30 common domestic tasks, everything from social planning to financial oversight, mothers reported having greater responsibility than their partners for 29 of those 30 tasks.
29 out of 30.
But the crucial finding, the one that tells the real story here, is the quantification of the disparity between the two types of labor.
Give us those numbers again, because I really think they are the foundation for the rest of this conversation. They're that important.
They are. On average, mothers reported being responsible for a staggering 72.57% of all cognitive labor. 72.5%.
Now compare that to the physical side. They reported being responsible for 63.64% of physical domestic labor.
So still unequal, but less so.
Much less so. This means the gender gap is significantly greater by almost 9 percentage points for the management and planning aspect than it is for the physical execution of the tasks.
Wow.
So even in couples who report being pretty happy with the physical split of chores, the burden of prospective memory, of remembering what needs to be done, remains overwhelmingly with the woman.
That 9% difference, that is the weight of the radar dish constantly spinning. That's the difference between doing a task and having the ultimate responsibility for ensuring the task is even identified and scheduled in the first place.
And we know precisely where this weight falls most heavily. The tasks that showed the highest gender disparity, where mothers shoulder the largest share of responsibility, are dominated by child-related tasks.
That doesn't surprise me. No, and they're tasks that require high emotional labor and that prospective memory. We're talking about managing the kids' healthcare appointments, monitoring their mental health or their emotional needs,
Right.
keeping track of their belongings and tidying up after them, and tasks like packing kids' backpacks and making sure they have all the necessary materials for school. These aren't just logistics.
No, they're about anticipating risk, developmental, educational, emotional risks.
Exactly. It seems like the tasks that are most related to nurturing, to empathy, and to mitigating future risk, they just instantly default to the woman.
Yeah.
And conversely, the tasks that were most equally split, the least gendered, were non-child related or just inherently less cognitively demanding.
Like what?
Things like taking out the garbage, simple home maintenance, and paying routine bills. These tasks either require very low anticipation, the garbage is full, you take it out.
It's reactive, not proactive.
Exactly. Or they're scheduled and predictable, like bills. They lack that boundaryless nature of, say, anticipating a child's long-term social or educational needs.
So if the data is this clear, that the problem isn't the doing, it's the managing, then the core issue is the relentless mental exhaustion of running this surveillance system.
It is.
And that brings us to a fascinating analogy you mentioned earlier, one borrowed from a completely different, very high-stress field.
Yes. We can really understand the psychological burden of the mental load by comparing it directly to the phenomenon of alert fatigue.
Alert fatigue. Okay.
It's what's experienced by engineers and operators who are managing incredibly complex systems. Think about a modern tech company that runs distributed systems, microservices, cloud architecture. These systems are designed to constantly monitor themselves and flag any deviation from the norm.
I understand that concept well. In a complex IT environment, if a system is working properly, it might generate thousands of alerts a day. Warnings, low-priority diagnostics, automated notifications, just a constant stream of information.
Precisely. And the goal is safety, of course. But when the system generates this constant, overwhelming stream of notifications, especially if many of them are low priority, irrelevant, or even false positives, the human operators become desensitized.
They just start tuning it out.
They do. This is alert fatigue. It leads to profound stress, high burnout rates, and the critical danger that the engineer will dismiss or completely miss the one truly critical, catastrophic system failure because it's buried under a mountain of noise.
Their mental capacity for proactive work is just completely drained.
Yes, drained by the necessity of constantly filtering all that background noise.
So that constant low-grade domestic hum, the status of the laundry, the low pantry inventory, the child needing new socks, the vague worry about that school field trip form, that is the microservice alerting system running 24/7 in the home manager's brain.
It is a perfect parallel. The constant low-grade stream of domestic and emotional alerts drains women's mental reserves. And these are the reserves that are necessary for executive functions like concentration, creative problem-solving, and exercising willpower in other domains.
Like your actual paid job or personal goals.
Whether that's paid work or personal goals, exactly. The cognitive load isn't necessarily about the severity of any one single alert, but the sheer volume and the permanence of the monitoring function itself. The mental radar is still spinning even when the house is quiet, and that severely interferes with true relaxation or deep focus.
And the psychological cost of this isn't just abstract. It's not just a feeling. It translates into very real, measurable harm.
It absolutely does. The unequal cognitive labor burden is strongly correlated with significant negative psychological consequences. Study after study consistently shows that mothers carrying this burden report increased depressive symptoms, elevated stress levels, and much higher rates of personal burnout.
And that has to impact the relationship.
Critically, these negative outcomes lead to a reduction in overall mental health, and they frequently reduce relationship quality because the manager is just exhausted and, frankly, resentful.
It's important to reiterate that data point here, the one that separates the cognitive from the instrumental.
This is the definitive distinction. In the research that assesses these psychological impacts, the division of physical labor alone was not significantly associated with most measures of psychological well-being.
So even if your partner pitches in with the dishes, that's great, but it doesn't actually solve the core problem.
It doesn't alleviate the core exhaustion. It was the planning and management, the cognitive labor, that was the overwhelming primary source of detriment to mental health. The stress comes from the responsibility and the fear of failure, not just from the execution.
And that lack of visibility for the cognitive labor has to compound the problem. When you complete a physical task, there's often a tangible reward. Right? A clean room, a finished meal. It provides a sense of accomplishment. But when the labor is purely internal, anticipating, scheduling, monitoring, it goes unacknowledged, both by your partner and sometimes even by yourself.
The completion loop is broken, the mental energy is consumed, but there's no external validation or internal reward to refill the reserve.
Right.
This is why cognitive labor leads to such profound resource depletion. You are constantly spending mental energy without banking any corresponding sense of achievement. This drains your mental reserves, reducing your capacity to make long-term decisions or exercise self-control.
The very things you need to fight the fatigue in the first place.
There's a vicious cycle.
So if this chronic stress state depletes our resources and the mental load is about the fear of the system breaking down, we have to ask a deeper question. Why does one person feel they must carry it? And that takes us out of the realm of task management and into a much darker area, a full-blown psychological survival mechanism rooted in conditional safety.
Absolutely. The chronic, unrelenting nature of this domestic alert system often transforms into a deeply internalized psychological strategy, one learned very early in life. This moves us into the realm of trauma responses.
Okay.
And while we are familiar with fight, flight, and freeze, we must introduce the fourth, and in many ways the most culturally and gender-entrenched survival strategy: fawning.
Fawning. How exactly does fawning manifest, and why is it so often misidentified as just, people-pleasing?
It's a great question because they look similar on the surface. Fawning is a highly sophisticated adaptive trauma response that uses compliance, pleasing, appeasing, and exaggerated helpfulness, but specifically to disarm a potential threat or aggressor.
So it's a defense mechanism.
It's a defense mechanism. It's distinct from generalized people-pleasing because it's deployed not out of kindness, but out of necessity, a genuine threat to one's safety or well-being. This response typically emerges when the source of danger is someone the victim is dependent on for survival.
Like a critical parent or an emotionally volatile partner.
Exactly. Or any situation where resistance is perceived as guaranteeing worse, possibly even lethal outcomes. You use connection and submission to manage the aggressor.
So it's not kindness, it's risk mitigation. It's a strategy to keep the emotional environment stable because instability is perceived as too dangerous.
Yeah, precisely. And this is not just an individual response, it is culturally institutionalized. Societal norms train women from a very young age to anticipate male anger and strive diligently to minimize it.
To be the peacemaker.
To be the peacemaker, to smooth over social tension, manage men's emotional fragility, and be the human shock absorbers for volatility, simply to avoid potential emotional or physical punishment. What society praises as politeness, niceness, or being agreeable in women is often a deeply ingrained set of survival behaviors developed under conditions of unequal power.
The implication here is, it's profound. A woman running that chronic domestic alert system, the one who ensures all the small things go right, is often doing so because the alternative, a break in the domestic harmony, exposes her to a level of conflict or disapproval that her nervous system perceives as genuinely threatening.
That is the tragic loop. Her emotional security has always been conditional. Conditional on the smooth functioning of the home and the placid emotional state of the people around her. If she stops managing the laundry, the resulting frustration from her partner or child might trigger the very conflict she is biologically programmed to prevent. The mental load becomes the maintenance protocol for her conditional safety.
The most devastating consequence, however, comes from how society then interprets this survival strategy when things go terribly wrong, particularly within the justice system.
It is the ultimate systemic failure. This survival strategy is devastatingly weaponized in contexts like the courtroom. When a woman is silent or placating or seemingly compliant during an assault, all manifestations of the freeze or fawn responses, this behavior is frequently misinterpreted by the justice system as consent.
Or willingness.
Or willingness, exactly. The legal framework often fails to acknowledge that a survivor may be operating purely from the survival imperative, aligning with the aggressor's demands not out of desire, but because resistance could escalate the danger.
It's a profound legal blindness, isn't it? It reflects a patriarchal logic that centers the perpetrator's perspective and completely dismisses the victim's reality of constrained agency.
It reinforces the structural power imbalance at the highest level. By demanding that a survivor exhibit an externally visible physical fight response to validate their lack of consent, the system is essentially punishing women for employing an effective, trauma-informed survival tactic.
So they're forced into a terrible choice.
A terrible choice. Risk lethal violence by fighting, or employ fawning and risk having their own trauma response used to protect the aggressor. And this also plays out in family court, where survivors disclosing intimate partner violence are often doubted or penalized because their very trauma responses, anxiety, compliance, silence, are framed as instability or weakness, thus protecting the perpetrators.
That's the external societal cost. But what is the internal psychological consequence of constantly running the fawn response? You mentioned self-abandonment.
Self-abandonment is the price of constant external adaptation. When your energy is relentlessly directed outward, anticipating the needs and emotional states of others, you lose clarity about your own internal world.
You lose touch with yourself.
Completely. You persistently bypass internal needs, feelings, and desires to adapt to external demands. The woman who is constantly asking, what do they need, eventually forfeits the capacity to even register the question, what do I need?
And what's happening physiologically during this process? Is the body just calm because the person appears agreeable?
Quite the opposite. Beneath the surface of being overly agreeable or highly efficient, the nervous system remains in a chronic state of threat because true, authentic needs are being invalidated and ignored.
So it's a low-grade internal conflict.
A profound, low-grade internal conflict. The body is always ready for danger, even if the exterior seems calm and collected. This persistent nervous system dysregulation, the lack of safe, restorative rest, is what leads us toward the most severe health consequences later on.
To truly gain a complete nuanced picture, we have to look across the relational divide. The mental load discourse often focuses so heavily on the female manager, but we have to acknowledge that partners are not passive actors.
Yeah.
And they often carry invisible high-stakes burdens, too.
Yes.
If we ignore the factors that discourage men from participating fully, the problem is never solved.
That is absolutely essential for any kind of structural change. If the conversation remains one-sided, it leads to understandable resentment and the complaint that the mental load is somehow self-inflicted. And one of the most common frustrations reported by men is what we can call the micromanagement barrier. This is the deep, genuine frustration that any contribution they make is immediately judged against an impossible standard.
We hear so many relatable examples of this. The criticism for folding towels the wrong way, or using the wrong type of soap, or stacking the dishwasher inefficiently. These seem so trivial, but they become huge obstacles.
They're massive obstacles because they're often perceived as a challenge to the man's competence, not as a constructive suggestion. If a man takes initiative, say he cleans the kitchen, and the managing partner immediately criticizes how the sponge was used or when he chose to clean it, that initiative is punished.
And the consequence is predictable.
It is. Many men stop trying. They withdraw from that specific task, thinking if she wants it done her way, she should just manage it herself. And then the partner who criticized ends up absorbing the entire load, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of being overwhelmed.
I have to push back on that, though. Isn't it a reasonable expectation that if one partner has been doing a task for 10 years, they have optimized the process? They want the task done to a certain quality, especially if they are the one who will have to clean up the fallout if it's done poorly.
Of course.
How do we distinguish a legitimate boundary, say don't ruin the cashmere sweater, from micromanagement that actually prevents the transfer of cognitive load?
That's a critical question because the distinction lies entirely in the transfer of control. Micromanagement happens when the managing partner retains the decision-making control and the monitoring function.
So they delegate the task, but not the responsibility.
Exactly. They might delegate the instrumental labor, the doing, but they retain the cognitive labor, the monitoring, the correcting, and taking responsibility for the outcome. To genuinely transfer the cognitive load, the managing partner must accept that the task will be done differently.
And maybe not as well at first.
Perhaps to a lower standard than their own internal optimal standard. The refusal to tolerate a different method is what keeps the cognitive burden anchored to the person who set the standard. It's an act of deep vulnerability to release that control.
So the argument is that perfectionism, in this context, is an anchor for the mental load.
It is the inability to sacrifice the internal standard for the sake of relational equity. But we also have to acknowledge the high-stakes, unacknowledged mental and emotional burdens men often report carrying based on traditional roles that are overlooked when we only discuss domestic chores.
Let's start with the crushing weight of those traditional expectations.
The first is the financial provision burden. For men raised in traditional roles, the constant existential expectation to provide financial security and the profound anxiety associated with potential job loss or failure is a relentless mental burden.
It's its own 247 alert system.
It runs 24/7, much like the mental load, but it is often treated as a silent duty, not acknowledged as labor or stress by partners. It is the invisible pressure of being the economic safety net and the fear of letting the family fall.
And the second burden, which often comes with this, is the expectation of being the emotional pillar.
This is deeply damaging. The traditional masculine role demands that men be the rock, emotionally stoic, stable, and protective. And this means they are often forced to suppress their own vulnerability and distress.
And what happens when they try not to?
The problem arises when they attempt to break that stoicism and confide in a partner. Men frequently report that if they show genuine vulnerability or distress, the conversation quickly shifts.
How so?
It either becomes about comforting her reaction to his distress, meaning he still has to manage her emotions, or his sadness is met with indifference, or worse, used against him later as a sign of weakness or inability to cope.
So, if his security is conditional on him being the rock, then admitting weakness becomes a threat to his survival within the relationship dynamic. That lack of emotional freedom is a huge part of the unseen burden.
It absolutely is. They carry immense emotional weight, but are denied the critical emotional outlet needed for recovery and genuine connection. It's a reciprocal denial of emotional processing.
Okay.
Then there are the intermittent workloads. These are the high-intensity one-off tasks that carry huge financial or emotional risk, but they occur irregularly, so they aren't on a chore chart.
Like choosing the new family car, or negotiating a mortgage refinance, or dealing with a major home repair like a broken boiler.
Exactly. These tasks require immense, concentrated cognitive effort, deep research, and they carry high stress. If you choose the wrong financing, it costs the family thousands. If you hire the wrong contractor, the house is damaged.
They're invisible until they fail.
And the consequences of failure are severe. They are high-stakes cognitive burdens, but because they aren't continuous, their mental weight is often ignored in daily chore lists.
And finally, the expectation of competence. The pressure to just know how to handle everything physical.
This expectation is a cultural relic of idealized masculinity. Men feel they must maintain a facade of competence, especially around home maintenance and technical repairs, without ever having been taught. They can't admit they don't know how to fix a leaky faucet or install a circuit breaker.
So what do?
This forces secret, anxiety-driven self-education hours spent watching YouTube tutorials, learning high-stakes skills completely alone. This pressure to maintain the facade of competence is a relentless source of mental work and anxiety that often goes completely unacknowledged.
When we put all these burdens together, the chronic managerial alert system primarily carried by women, and the high-stakes intermittent anxiety and emotional suppression carried by men, we realize that both sets of these deeply entrenched gender roles levy a severe, quantifiable mental and physical cost.
The systemic cost is starkly visible in public health data. Women are statistically twice as likely as men to experience clinical depression. Similarly, anxiety disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD, show a much higher prevalence among women.
And while there are biological factors.
Yes, biological factors like hormonal changes, postpartum depression, and PMDD, they play a part. But these factors are profoundly aggravated by social and cultural stressors, primarily the burden of chronic caregiving and the necessity of managing conditional emotional security.
And we cannot discuss this mental health crisis without acknowledging the trauma component. Violence against women is a massive systemic contributor to this chronic state of alert.
It is the root cause of the conditional security. Global estimates suggest nearly 1 in 3 women worldwide experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. Survivors of this violence face a significantly increased risk of developing PTSD, chronic anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. This background threat, coupled with the relentless societal pressures of caregiving and economic vulnerability, creates an environment where chronic stress is not a risk, but a permanent state.
And linking back to the fawn response, the assertion that this behavior, compulsively prioritizing others' needs while ignoring one's own, has profound physical consequences, is one of the most powerful insights in all this.
It connects the emotional structure directly to the physical structure. Trauma experts like Dr. Gabor Mate, among others, argue compellingly that the deep, lifelong acculturation of women into prioritizing external emotional needs and constantly suppressing their own truth is fundamentally associated with the high prevalence of certain chronic physical illnesses.
When the nervous system is held in that state of suppressed, persistent threat, it shifts resources.
It does.
What specific conditions are we talking about?
We see associations with conditions where the body essentially turns on itself. Autoimmune diseases, certain non-smoking related cancers, and the overwhelming majority of chronic migraine sufferers. The data shows women take twice as many antidepressants and anxiety medications compared to men.
So what's the theory there?
The theory suggests that the habituation of the fawn response keeps the fight-flight system on a low but continuous burn, leading to chronic inflammation and immune system dysfunction. The cognitive labor translates directly into physical disease because the self-abandonment required by the survival strategy creates a continuous toxic stress cycle.
It is a shocking thought that the reason your body is unwell might be directly tied to the lifetime of effort spent ensuring everyone else is emotionally comfortable.
And we must layer the socioeconomic factors onto this reality. This chronic stress is not distributed equally. Women living in poverty, those with less educational access, or those in marginalized communities are at exponentially increased risk of poor mental health and violence. Economic instability acts as a magnifier for every single stressor we've discussed.
And even if a woman recognizes she needs support, the system itself erects barriers to care.
The barriers are systemic and practical. There's the stigma associated with viewing mental struggle as a weakness, the prohibitive financial limitations of accessing quality mental health care, and most practically, the caregiving responsibilities themselves.
Right. When are you supposed to find the time or energy to attend therapy when you are the sole manager of the household logistics?
It's a huge problem. And furthermore, the historical underrepresentation of women in clinical research has led to significant gaps in gender-specific treatment approaches, meaning the care that is available is often built on a male as default assumption.
So if we accept that this crisis is rooted in conditional safety and systemic power imbalances, then the solution requires much more than just a polite suggestion to share the weekly chores. It requires dismantling the entire alert architecture.
That's the critical pivot in the solutions section. Shifting from simply demanding task splitting to advocating for true emotional support and structural change.
On the macro level.
On the macro level, we absolutely need to address the root causes of conditional security through policy. This means implementing policies for equal pay, robust paid parental leave for both parents, and comprehensive legal protection against gender-based violence. If you reduce the economic and physical safety threats, you reduce the necessity of the chronic internal alert system.
But relationally, within the home, how do we shift the dynamic from one person managing the stability to both partners truly sharing the cognitive load and the emotional risk?
The goal is fostering genuine engagement and challenging what we call social role theory. This theory often implicitly assumes women are the natural experts in perspective memory and communal roles. True equity means encouraging men's genuine, proactive engagement in these roles, challenging them to be the ones who remember the school calendar, the dentist checkup, or the oil change without being prompted. It's about cultivating their ability to anticipate needs, not just perform tasks upon delegation.
And we must return to that micromanagement barrier. For the cognitive load to transfer, the manager has to let go of control. That is perhaps the hardest practical step.
It requires a conscious, difficult sacrifice. For the partner who has carried the heavy management burden to genuinely reduce their cognitive load, they must accept that the task will be done in a different way, or to a standard lower than their own internal optimal.
That's a huge ask.
It is. This isn't about leaving the house filthy. It's about accepting that the towels will be folded differently, or the dishes might be stacked in a way you wouldn't choose, or that the grocery list might be less optimized. This is the mechanism by which control is transferred, empowering the other partner to own the decision-making and accept the consequences, the cognitive load. If the manager retains the right to monitor, criticize, and immediately correct, the burden never transfers.
On a personal level, for the person who has internalized the fawn response as a survival technique, what does the pathway to unlearning that response and reclaiming personal authenticity look like?
It is a profound, brave journey back to the self. One of the very first steps is identifying and connecting with genuine safety anchors.
Safety anchors.
Because fawning is driven by perceived threat, the individual must systematically notice, validate, and honor internal signals to identify who, what, where, and when they feel authentically safe, supported, and accepted without condition. By grounding the nervous system in authentic safety, you reduce the perceived necessity of the chronic alert system.
And for those who have spent a lifetime suppressing their own needs to keep the peace, how do they even begin to assert themselves?
That involves practicing self-compassion, which is a blend of both tenderness and fierceness.
Tenderness and fierceness.
Tenderness is comforting oneself without self-judgment, validating the difficulty of the survival strategy. Fierceness is the protective, assertive side. Because fawning often means overriding the natural biological fight response, a critical part of developing boundary clarity is allowing and validating anger.
Anger gets such a bad rap, especially for women.
It does, but it's essential. This doesn't mean explosive, destructive expression. It means recognizing anger as a legitimate energy signal that says, a boundary has been crossed and I need to protect myself.
So channeling that internal energy into assertive self-advocacy, saying no, expressing a need, or standing up to protect oneself, rather than letting that energy consume you internally.
It is the reclamation of one's own reality and needs, which the fawn response compels one to bypass. The journey is about listening to the real self, the one that knows what it needs and what is unjust, and daring to give voice to that truth, thus pulling away the curtain that keeps one's own needs out of sight.
This deep dive has profoundly redefined the mental load for me. It is so far from being a simple chore list. It's a complex psychological defense system born out of conditional emotional and physical security, deeply entrenched in cultural conditioning.
We've established that the mental load is less about who does the actual task and much more about who is held responsible for the overall systemic stability, emotional, domestic, social, and metastating, the devastating psychological and physical toll of maintaining that permanent state of alert. Addressing this imbalance requires tackling the quantitative data, understanding the alert fatigue, recognizing the trauma of fawning, and acknowledging the heavy, invisible burdens carried by all partners under these rigid gender roles.
The efficiency and sanity required to manage a modern life, whether you're engineering a complex network or running a family, relies entirely on reducing unnecessary noise and ensuring all alerts are actionable and owned by the responsible party. If someone in your life is running a constant invisible surveillance system because they feel their security is conditional, the solution is not just to offer to help with a task or to clean a specific room. The lasting solution requires actively dismantling the entire alert architecture by sharing the anticipation, the management, the emotional responsibility, and the subsequent risk of failure. This is the only path to move from conditional safety to true equity.